Siang Pak Adianto. Siang Pak.
Siang Bang.
Oh ya.
Siang.
Kabar Pak.
Aduh, ini jam yang sama yang acara nikel jalan.
Oh iya. Oh iya.
Saya jadi bingung. Nih sama Pak apa ini Pak
Dendi ya?
Pak Dan. Gitulah.
Iya, kan sebentar aja nih. Ini dari Pak Adianto baru kita lanjut ke ini kan. Nanti saya yang teruskan ya.
Desi nanti Bang.
Oh iya ya, aman. Iya, saya kamera video off dulu sebentar Pak ya. Saya udah standby.
Siap. Siap Bang.
Suara kedengaran jelas ya Pak?
Jelas Bang, jelas.
Oke, siap saya off ya.
Oke, siap Bang. Pak Agi, itu kebalik Pak, itu apanya? Harus dipakai ininya, apa namanya? Ya, kebalik. Harus dipakai lensanya ya.
Pak Adianto.
Ya.
Yang agenda ini jadwalnya ini coba lihat di itu deh. Itu masing-masing berapa menit nih? Ini Pak Bill kan 14.25, 14.45. Okay. Pak Limardi kayaknya salah tulis nih sampai jam berapa? Jam 15.05 ya.
Oh, Pak Mardi ya. Aku sudah bilang Pak Mardi maksimal 15 menit ya Pak gitu.
Oh gitu. Jadi Pak Limardi jam 15 selesai. Pak Dendi berapa lama Pak?
Paling segitu aja nanti Bang, 15 saja.
15 ya. Berarti
satu pembicara.
Pak Dendi jam 3.15. Terus 3.15 itu berarti panel discussion.
Pak,
itu Liana sama Pak Hari ya. Habis itu Bu Liana, sorry ya.
Bu Liana
15 menit gitu ya.
Sebetulnya hampir nggak ada sih itunya
diskusi dengan ini.
Panel diskusinya karena cuma satu kan, jadi langsung aja.
Tapi tetap kita buka ini dari audiens Bang ya.
Tetap. Cuman Pak ini nanti jadinya dia bawa persentase 10 menit lah.
Siapa dari Pak
Kris?
Oh Pak Kris ya. Jadi yang opening itu opening speech dari Bu Pande ya Pak.
Bu Pande.
Oke, ini kita ini waktunya limit juga ya kayak 15 menit ya.
Iyalah.
Mungkin Pak Bil agak lebih panjang mungkin ya.
Iya. Iya Bang.
Oke, sebentar ya. 25 BKF. Ini dari BKF ya Bu Pande ya.
BKF ya.
Oke. Bu Liana ada presentasinya nggak Pak?
Ada
juga ya.
Bu Liana nanti presentasinya malah aku lihat banyak halamannya, jadi nanti kita infokan aja tetap 15 menit paling lama.
Kita waktunya agak ini soalnya banyak pembicaranya nih. Pak Dendi ya, Bu Liana dulu, Pak Limardi ya. Pak Limardi ada paparan juga Pak ya?
Ada. Saya kirim sama semua ya.
Pak Limardi ya. Pak Bu Liana, habis Pak Limardi baru Bu Liana ya. Pak Dendi dulu ya. Sesuai ikutin aja ya, ikutin ini
Ikutin
kan
aja.
ya. Ikutin ya. Wah ini padat nih kayaknya Pak ya, harus
Iya.
benar-benar ini nih. Kita berarti cuma 20 menit Q&A ya Pak ya, kalau lihat dari ini ya.
Siap Bang. Ya. Saya jawab dulu ini ya yang
Silakan Pak.
Siapa Dendi?
Oh. Oke.
Halo, selamat siang, Pak Dianto, Om Hendra.
Halo, Pak Kris. Selamat siang, Pak. Apa kabar, Pak?
Aku rambutku udah kayak Om Hendra nih,
Nah, gitu dong.
karena nyari tukang cukur nggak dapat Om Hendra, jadi cukur sendiri.
Gitu akhirnya ya.
Aduh,
Halo,
apa
Pak Bill.
kabar? Halo Pak Bill.
Hello.
Hey, how are you, Pak Bill?
Yes, I'm well, everyone.
Good. You in Jakarta, Pak Bill?
I'm in Sydney at the moment.
Oh, in
So
Sydney. I heard that Sydney is imposing a lockdown, right?
that's right.
New South
That-
Wales.
You're
Wow.
correct. Correct.
How long for the lockdown? Is it a hard lockdown or what is it?
Well, I think a soft,
Soft lockdown,
soft lockdown.
like
Soft.
a PPKM here, yeah.
a bit like that, yes.
PPKM.
And how are things in Jakarta, Sonali?
Things, yeah, still little bit returning to normal, ya, Pak Kris, ya.
Ya, Pak Bill, little bit normal, not much ambulance anymore, Pak Bill.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
The good thing is we haven't heard so many ambulance sirens in the last few days. Yeah.
Oh, that's good news. That's good news. Well, I'm expecting to be back in Jakarta at the end of September.
I see.
Halo Pak Bill.
Yes.
Thank you,
Hope-
Pak. Thank you for your time, Pak Bill.
My pleasure.
I think that you already in Jakarta.
No, I'm in Sydney.
Oh, so already 2 years, ya Pak?
I beg your pardon?
Almost 2 years.
No, I went back to Jakarta last August, and I was in Jakarta until May of this year, and then I came back to Sydney at the end of April, early May.
Oh, before the spread of Delta variant, yeah. You
Correct.
come back. I see.
Halo Pak Kris, terima kasih Pak.
Halo Pak Adi, terima kasih sama-sama Pak. Senang bisa bergabung sama Pak Bill, Om Hendra, as usual.
Like your haircut, Pak Chris. Welcome to the club, Pak.
Ya. It's difficult to find a barber shop opening during PPKM, Pak Hendra. So what do you think, Pak Hendra? Will we continue next PPKM next week, Pak Hendra?
I have no idea, but I don't think the government will brave enough to extend further the.
Yeah. It's already like last year, so
Yeah,
it's
Pak.
too much.
How about in Kalimantan, Pak Hari? Have you been there?
Oh, yeah. I
Lately?
cannot there because it's so difficult to get the PCR in the 1 days. So they need another 3-4 days to PCR. So actually the operation is nearly affected. A lot of my person is got sick due to COVID-19
Mhm.
and influenced the operation. But not only us, but a lot of company runs us giving same influenced by COVID-19.
I see.
But again, is we are almost half our employee in the operation Kalimantan is already vaccines. But again, is another KIPI, the sickness after vaccine.
Mhm.
It makes difficult also the operations.
I see.
So a little bit disturbing for the operation now in the Kalimantan.
Not Kalimantan's relatively okay, yeah, in compared
No,
to
Pak,
East
Pak Hendra.
Kalimantan. Huh?
A little bit okay in Kalimantan. But again, it's somehow, yes, the worst one is in the East Kalimantan. Our operation in the Tenggarong is affected, heavily affected.
I see.
Whenever your operation is very remote, like in North Kalimantan, the COVID is the pandemic is not little bit affected, but when you operate in the nearby head of regency like Tenggarong, it will be difficult for us to
Yes, yes.
isolate the operations.
Selamat datang Ibu Pandey. Halo Ibu Pandey, selamat datang Bu.
Selamat siang Bapak.
Halo, selamat siang Bu Pandey.
Boleh ganti namanya Bu?
Oh.
Saya izin ganti ya Bu.
Ya silakan Pak, silakan. Mohon maaf ini sebelumnya sudah diinformasikan ya?
Yang mana Ibu?
Ya maksudnya Pak Febrio hari ini tidak berhalangan hadir, maka diminta untuk diwakilkan.
Sudah Bu, sudah.
Ya, terima kasih.
Salam
Untuk
kenal
mengubah
Bu
nama,
Pandey. Ya.
Saya nggak bisa ganti ya.
untuk mengubah nama ini siapa? Saya?
Coba dari Ibu saya nggak bisa ya. Kenapa nggak bisa ya? Coba Ibu. Welcome Bu Liana. Sama
Selamat siang.
Pak
Selamat
Den-
siang Bu Liana.
Pak Dendi.
Selamat siang Bu Liana.
Halo, selamat siang Pak Dianto,
Thank
Bu
you.
Liana,
Selamat
Pak
siang
Dendi.
Pak
Selamat
Dendi.
siang Pak Dendi.
Selamat siang semuanya.
Selamat siang
Siang.
semua.
Terima kasih artikelnya Pak Dendi.
Oh, Pak Hendra, apa kabar Pak?
Terima kasih. Pak Bill also written a very nice article in the Call Asia on carbon tax. Yeah, thank you, Pak Bill.
Pleasure, personally.
Bu Liana masih di Singapura ya, Bu Liana?
Halo Pak Dendi, apa kabar Pak Dendi?
Halo,
Hey Bu Desi,
baik Bu Desi, apa
Wah.
kabar juga?
baru jumpa lagi Bu Desi.
Baru ketemu lagi. Sehat semua ya Pak ya?
Puji Tuhan, Alhamdulillah.
Baik Bu.
Tuhan.
Heeh.
Sehat semua Ibu.
Harusnya kita hari ini pakai merah putih nih Pak Kris ya?
Benar. Kenapa ya lupa ya aku merah putih?
Waduh, iya ya.
Aduh, benar. Walaupun sehari tetap aja harusnya.
Iya ya.
Masih nuansa ceritanya.
Halo Bu Desi.
Ya Pak, bagaimana? Kita mulai jam berapa?
Desi, Bu Liana,
Iya Bu,
apa kabar?
puji Tuhan sehat Bu Liana. Masih di Singapura ya Bu ya?
Masih belum bisa pulang.
Kita juga masih dilanjut terus PPKM Ibu.
Iya, kalau pulang saya di karantina,
Oh iya,
iya Bu ya.
makanya belum mau pulang.
Sudah vaksin di Singapura Bu?
Sudah. Karena kalau nggak divaksin saya nggak bisa kemana-mana, Pak.
Oh
Nggak
iya
boleh.
ya.
Nggak boleh kemana-mana. Saya gambarnya udah muncul belum?
sudah Ibu, sudah.
Oh udah. Tapi
Iya.
saya belum nggak bisa lihat ya. Kenapa ya? Ntar dulu. View option ya.
Oh iya betul, view option Ibu.
View option, terus apa? Side by side.
Galeri.
Galeri. Oh, nggak ada galeri. Tunggu. View nggak ada di saya, adanya standar site. Oh ya ada galeri.
Ya,
Oke, ya.
siap. Kita masih nunggu siapa lagi nih ya, Pak Adi?
Ali Mardi mungkin ya.
Pak,
Oh,
sudah Pak Ali Mardi sudah.
Halo, selamat siang Pak.
Pak Ali Mardi, selamat siang.
Andra, apa kabar?
Kabar baik Pak. Wah, senang ketemu lagi
Semoga
nih, Pak.
sehat selalu nih Pak.
Puji Tuhan, alhamdulillah sehat Pak.
Syukurlah Pak. Ya.
Sudah semuanya sambil kita menunggu peserta lain. Jam berapa sekarang? Bu Pande, masih ada yang ditunggu Bu Pande?
Kalau dari saya sih enggak ya, cuma nanti linknya beda dengan yang tandanya rekan-rekan ingin bergabung begitu.
Ya ada yang jadi ini kan link pembicara ya Bu kalau yang Ibu, tapi yang peserta sebetulnya nanti bisa kita promote juga Bu kalau ada yang mau masuk ke dalam.
Oh, oke.
Ya, kalau ada nama di sini yang mau dimasukkan ya nanti kita bisa invite.
Oh, siap ya. Mungkin ada satu Bu Mita ya.
Bu Mita.
Saya akan minta untuk ya, maksud saya biar bisa mungkin support untuk share screen dan sebagainya.
Oh, Ibu Mifta ya Bu ya?
Ya.
Oke. Promote to panelis. Sudah.
Terima kasih. Baik, sudah bisa kita start ya.
Bu Desi, we can start now.
Oke, semua pembicara sudah bergabung?
Sudah.
Okay, good afternoon and hello everyone. I hope all of you are doing great today and happy Independence Day. I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Carbon Tax on Mining Sector, Opportunities and Challenges in Mining Industry in Indonesia, hosted by Coal and Mineral Asia magazine together with Petromindo. Recently, carbon tax has become an exciting topic of discussion in Indonesia. This carbon tax is introduced in a revised General Taxation Law Bill and become this year's national legislation program. So the Ministry of Finance has announced plans to introduce carbon pricing in an effort to help finance clean energy projects and boost tax revenues, as well as cut emissions in Southeast Asia's largest economy. So today we will discuss together about update on the government plans to impose carbon tax, how carbon tax potentially affecting the supply and demand of coal in Indonesia, what are the opportunities and challenges of planned carbon tax, and also legal overview of the planned carbon tax. All right, I would like to give a warm welcome to all honorable speakers and presenters joining with us today. Please welcome Ibu Pande Putu Oka Kusumawardani. She is the head of State Revenue Policy Center at Ministry of Finance. Hello, Bu Pande or Ibu Putu. What should I call you?
Putu is okay.
Oh, Ibu Putu. Thank you, Bu Putu, for joining us with us today. And please welcome our next speaker, Mr. Bill Sullivan. He is the Senior Foreign Counsel with Christian Theo and Partners, and also Senior Advisor to Stevenson Hartwood LLP. Hello, Pak Bill.
Hello.
Thank you very much, Pak Bill.
Pleasure. Pleasure.
And please welcome our next speaker, Bapak Ali Mardi. He is the tax partner of Deloitte Solutions. Halo, Pak Ali.
Selamat sore, Bu.
Ya, Pak. Terima kasih sudah bergabung, Pak Ali.
Terima kasih, sama-sama.
Please welcome our next speaker, Bapak Dendi Ramdhani. He is the Chief of Economist at Bank Mandiri. Selamat siang, Pak Dendi.
Halo, selamat siang. Selamat siang, everyone.
Hey, Pak Dendi.
Ya, Bu. Baik.
And please welcome our next speaker, Bapak Hari Kristiono or Pak Kris. He is the Chief Operating Officer at PT Medco Energy Mining Indonesia. Selamat siang, Pak Kris.
Selamat siang, Mbak Desi.
Terima kasih ya, Pak, sudah bergabung hari ini.
My pleasure, Mbak Desi.
Yes. And next, please welcome Ibu Liana Bratasida. She's the Executive Director of Indonesian Pulp and Paper Association.
Selamat siang, Bapak Ibu. Terima kasih.
Selamat siang, Bu Liana. Terima kasih atas waktunya. And please welcome our moderator of this webinar, Bapak Hendra Sinadia. He's the Executive Director of Indonesian Coal Mining Association. Selamat siang, Pak Hendra.
Selamat siang, Bu Desi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak, for your time today. And on behalf of the organizing committee, we would like to deeply thank and give a sincere appreciation to our wonderful partners and sponsor PT Pama Persada Nusantara. Thank you very much, PT Pama Persada Nusantara, for the great contribution and trust to our work. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, as usual, during this webinar, if you have any questions, you can type your questions in Q&A, and we will discuss it together later on Q&A sessions. Or if we still have time, you may click raise hand, and we will activate your microphone. So without further ado, I now give the virtual floor to Pak Hendra Sinadia.
Thank you very much, Bu Desi, for the introductions. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Salam Merdeka. We're still in the 17th August Independence Day mood. So happy Independence Day to all of you. Okay, so thank you for the invitations. And again, thank you, Pama Persada, for the sponsor. And nice to seeing our friends again in the webinar after a few months. Yeah. Okay, so the topic of the webinar this afternoon is very interesting. Yeah, talking about carbon tax. As we know that carbon tax has become the hot topic in the industry after the government submitted tax bill, a general provision of taxations bill to the parliament back to mid of June, if not mistaken. And in the article 44, number G is one of the provisions talking about the carbon tax, 75,000 rupiahs per kilo CO2 equivalent. This is the provision in the tax bills, and then after that, some industry associations and the APindo have talked with the governments, talked to the media about the potential impact of the carbon tax to the industry. And this webinar, we have a number of speakers who represent various backgrounds. Bu Putu from Ministry of Finance, Pak Kris from mining producers, ada Bu Liana from the industry, user of coal or fossil fuel for energy. We have also Pak Ali Mardi from tax, with the tax background, Pak Bill Sullivan from a law background, Pak Dendi as an analyst, economic analyst, So we have a quite excellent speaker for today. So back to the carbon tax again, as Bu Desi mentioned, is under the tax bill, and then now is being discussed in the parliament. And we have learned, we have read some comments made by the government side and the association side. As we know that most of the industry perspective, they not agree or challenging the provision of the tax, carbon tax, because some of the consideration that the carbon tax has not been discussed thoroughly with the industry. The government has not yet provided clear blueprint of the tax carbon, and at the moment also the government is proposing presidential regulation on carbon pricing. So it needs some kind of alignment between carbon pricing, cap trade, carbon pricing mechanism, carbon offset, and then also tax carbon. So the industry proposed that the government should drop the carbon tax provision from the tax bill, at least to have to allow industry to discuss more comprehensive with the government. But the government, of course, they have some background on how the government's decisions to introduce carbon tax, one of which is the Indonesian commitment, the government commitment to reduce emisi gas rumah kaca under the Paris Agreement. Indonesia has ratified its nationally determined contributions. The government has submitted the long-term strategy on low carbon initiative, and also Indonesian to host next year G20 meeting here. So carbon tax is one of the instruments to be introduced by the government in order to meet the target of net zero emission or Paris Agreement. But for the industry side, of course, the impact will be significant, not only for industry producing carbon emission, producing fuel emissions like coal or mineral or oil and gas, but also for the industry that still using mainly energy, reasonable energy from fossil fuel. As we know that fossil fuel has accounts of more than 60%, 68% of Indonesian electricity plant, and renewable are still far below the targeted, only so far only less than 12% of the national energy mix. So it's too far for renewable to catch up, to meet the national energy mix. So by imposing carbon tax, it will be deemed as a very significant burden for the industry. And Apindo also mentioned that the imposition of carbon tax is not in line with the spirit of the government to ease the investment with the introductions of the Cipta Kerja, Undang-Undang Cipta Kerja or Omnibus recently. So we're going to listen all the arguments in this webinar in this afternoon. Then first, I'd like to give space to ini presentation from the government side, yang hari ini diwakili oleh Bu Putu from Putu Oka, dari Bu Pandai Putu Oka dari Badan Kebijakan Fiskal, Fiscal Revenue, Fiscal Policy Head of dari BKF ya, mewakili Pak Febrio Kacaribu. As you know, Apindo and also BKF has met a few months ago with the meeting also was attended by Dirjen Pajak, and we learned a lot the argumentation from the government during the meeting. So we believe Bu Putu will explain to the audience about the position of the governments with regard to the carbon tax. Oke, silakan Bu Putu, waktunya 15 menit.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Hendra. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for attending this event. And first of all, allow me to extend my gratitude and also appreciation to Petromendo and also Call Asia Magazines for the invitations. And it is an honor to be here, of course, to meet all of you today. And I would like to use the opportunity to highlight how pivotal the topic of the carbon tax implementation plan Indonesia at this particular time, amid the growing discussions on what the policy means to the related industry, our economy, and also society as a whole. I hope that in this valuable opportunity, I can shed some light on its purpose, design, and also plan delivery to ensure its effectiveness. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, before diving into the scheme, let me start by highlighting that climate change has been a global issue, bringing all nations together into a common cause to undertake the ambitious efforts to combat and also adapt to its effect. Countries across the world adopted the Paris Agreement and pledged to address the issue. As an archipelagic country, Indonesia is also particularly vulnerable to the effect of climate change. In 2016, for example, Indonesia showed its commitment by ratifying the Paris Agreement and submitted the first nationally determined contributions, which sets a carbon emissions reduction target by 2030. And the target was to reduce 29% against the business as usual scenario and up to 41%, provided that it is aided by international support. And furthermore, the Paris Agreement also suggests a two-pronged approach, namely the mitigations and also the adaptations. And such approach underpin the framework and also strategy for low carbon and climate resilience. And those to realize the goals outlined in the NDC, the government has come up with a plan of action, among others, policy strengthening and implementation, encompassing the carbon pricing, climate finance, and also technology development and transfer, as well as the capacity building. And here, the carbon pricing serves as one of the tools and sources to fund the climate change agenda and efforts. Next, please. And essentially, implementing the climate change action plan will require substantial funding and also investment. On the national level, there are some policy instruments and initiatives deemed to support the climate change agenda. In 2018 until now, the state budget has been an important measure to provide funding. Although there are still rooms to maximize or to optimize further. And to close the funding gap, the government has been continuously looking at untapped resources, innovative and also novel means of financing, both through the state or non-state budget instruments. And in the same vein, we acknowledge that the private and also international sectors both have a crucial role in providing the funding and also the resources. However, in addition to promoting, facilitating, and also working closely with stakeholders across sectors, we also found that the applications of carbon pricing in terms of carbon tax or carbon trading can be a lever to reduce the carbon emissions. Next, please. Well, the state budget is arguably the most potential instrument of the government in carrying out its policies and also realizing national goals. With that in mind, we believe that sound fiscal policy should be developed, designed, and also utilized to support the climate change agenda. In the slide, as you can see here, there are 4 sets of policies, tax and excise facilities to stimulate the development of renewable energy and clean technology. That was the first. And the second one, climate budgeting mechanism in the national planning and budgeting system. The third one, transfer to subnational and village funds, or commonly called as TKDD. And the fourth one is the innovative financing for sustainable development in the form of green bond or sukuk, and also SDGs government securities. Next, please. Well, this slide, seeing the average climate change budget allocations in the during the year 2018 until 2020 state budget, the number may look considerable, which is 102.6 trillion rupiah per year. And however, we saw a downward in the trend during this period. And therefore, it is necessary to strengthen the climate change commitments in the work plans of the ministries and government agencies in the future. Next, please. Meanwhile, in the terms of tax policy, a wide array of incentives has been given to encourage new renewable energy investment and also reduce, for example, motor vehicle CO2 emissions, and instruments like tax holiday, tax allowance, VAT facility, import tax facility, property tax incentives, luxury tax, motor vehicle were also issued to bolster the climate change effort. Next, please. As touched upon earlier, in 2018, Indonesia issued a global green sukuk, followed by a retail green sukuk in 2019. And supported by the UNDP, this innovative financing has supported the green projects in 5 eligible sectors. And it also contributes to plenty of the SDS target. And you may see in the slide, the development of the green bond or sukuk issuance during year by year until 2029. Next, please. Okay, the government has also mobilized funding for the climate change through the non-state budget initiatives. Some of them are the SDGs Indonesia 1, which is an integrated funding cooperation platform managed by one of the Ministries of Finance Special Vehicle Missions, which is SMI, and also the BLU, or Indonesian Environment Fund, IEF, that manages and also provides the funds needed for environment and also forestry protections, preservations and also conservations, biodiversity management, and also climate change mitigations and also adaptation. Next, please. That the international support, such as through the Green Climate Fund, could be also beneficial to help Indonesia achieve the NDC, or the nationally determined contribution target, without burdening the state budget. And the GCF is the implementing entity for the UNFCCC financial mechanisms, which is aimed at supporting developing countries. As the world's largest climate change finance or funds, it allows Indonesia to have a variety of financial instruments and a balanced target between mitigations and also adaptation. Next, please. Well, by definitions, carbon pricing, or also known as the economic value of carbon, it is the price or valuations of greenhouse gas or carbon emissions. In other words, it is putting a price on carbon. In many countries, carbon pricing, the policy has been implemented to reduce national carbon emission. In particular, it is used as a policy intervention for market failure by utilizing market forces. By applying polluters pay principles, it encourages and also promotes a low emissions business and also business ecosystem. As a result, it can be a promising alternative source of sustainable financing for the government. There are two main types of carbon pricing applied in the world. The first one is trading instruments, and the second one is non-trading instruments. The trading instruments can be either emission trading systems or emissions offset. Meanwhile, the non-trade instruments can be divided into two categories. The first one is carbon tax, and also the second one is result-based payments. And currently, the government is preparing regulations on carbon pricing as well, taking into account the discussions of Article 6 Paris Agreement. And the proposed scheme is imposing a carbon tax based on content or carbon emitting activity. Next, please. Okay. Well, actually, before preparing the regulations, the government has conducted the study, discussions, and also several consultations with private stakeholders. Started in 2018 with a study of carbon pricing, market-based instrument options, and a discussions on implementing carbon trading in Indonesia. And also in the year 2020, for example, it was decided regulations on carbon pricing will take the form of presidential regulation, and levies on carbon were one of the instruments to be regulated. And this year, the preparations of the carbon pricing implementations involve several fundamental steps, such as discussions with the DPR on the proposed carbon tax in the proposed KUP law revision, and also finalizations of the presidential regulations on carbon pricing and development of technical mechanisms for carbon market and carbon tax. We hope that carbon trading through carbon exchange implementations could be introduced, for example, in the year 2024, and carbon tax can follow the synchronizations with them. And regarding the objective, the proposed carbon tax aims to reduce the level of greenhouse gas emissions and promote production efficiency in high carbon content or emitted sectors. The carbon tax will be imposed on the carbon content of particular goods and activities that emit carbon for a particular sector. The government proposed the tax rate to be 75 rupiah per kilogram of CO2 emissions, or around $5 per ton CO2 emissions. However, the carbon tax rate, along with the whole implementations, will be evaluated periodically in line with the development of the emission rate and also the performance of the national economy. So the government also plans to implement a well, there is some alternatives and also discussions on this. Non-taxable emissions limit is needed either for specific sectors or all sectors. And another consideration is whether the carbon tax applies uniformly or in a price sense, concerning the fairness and also affordability. Nonetheless, the revenue from the carbon tax might be very beneficial for numerous initiatives, including but not limited to finance mitigations and adaptations projects, support investment in clean technology and also energy efficiency, or strengthen the social safety net for vulnerable communities.
Ya, mohon maaf Bu, waktunya 2 menit Bu.
Yeah, so I think this is my last slide on this part, or maybe 2. So it's worth noting that immense challenges can be faced also by carbon tax implementations. The first one is the right timing and momentum in implementing carbon tax. This will be crucial to minimize the economic distortions after the COVID-19 pandemic. So the implementations of carbon tax will take this into considerations. And the second one, the determinations of carbon tax subjects that are compatible with the Indonesia's economic structure. The third is ensuring that the implementations of a carbon tax is in harmony with the carbon trading scheme and also accompanied policies to minimize impact and optimize economic and environmental benefits it can create. And last but not least, enabling strong institutions, including fair regulations and also a simple tax system, and also accountable MRV system is also necessary. Well, I would like to sum up by mentioning 3 essential points. The first one, in terms of regulations preparations, the finalizations of the presidential regulations on carbon pricing is still underway, currently in the stage of discussions and also deepening of the KUP law revisions discussions with the DPR. And in addition, the implementations of the carbon tax would require further regulation through derivative regulations. The second one, the Ministry of Finance is continuously conducting in-depth study, analysis, and also discussions with stakeholders to optimize the carbon tax implementations. And we believe in deepening to implement companion policies for optimizing economic performance and reducing carbon emissions is necessary. And synchronizations with carbon trading schemes will be also a salient feature of the policy implementations. As the momentum for carbon tax implementation is key to effective implementations, the government considers the right time, especially in the post-COVID-19 economic recovery phase. So I think that will be all from me. I return back to you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, Bu Pande Putu Oka Kusumawardani, Head of State Revenue Policy Center of Ministry of Finance, for the very informative presentations. Yeah, there are some interesting points that you made in your presentations. By the way, I like the closing, the last point you made in the closing session, that the government is looking for the right time. Yeah, the timing is very crucial indeed. Yeah, thank you. And also, we're going to explore later on. I believe Pak Ali Mardi and other participants will like to digging more on the scheme. Yeah, you mentioned about the proposal for how the government will utilize the proceed revenue from the carbon tax and so on. So thank you very much, Bu Putu, for the presentation. We'll get back to you later in the Q&A. Okay. Good afternoon, participants. We now moving to the next presenter. Yeah? Our friend Pak Bill Sullivan is a senior foreign counsel with the Christian Theo and Partner, and also senior advisor to Stephenson Harwood LLP. He's joining us from Sydney, Australia now. And by the way, Pak Bill has written a very comprehensive article in the Coal Asia magazine, July-August editions, the title "Carbon Tax Possible Solution." What is the article? Is it about carbon tax proposal? Yeah? Possible solution to multiple problems. So, ladies and gentlemen, please, we are going to listen presentation from Pak Bill Sullivan. Silakan Pak Bill.
Thank you. Just a second. Okay.
Hello.
Yes, Pastor
Yes.
Nadi, I'm trying to share my presentation, but I'm having some difficulty with it.
Let's see.
Oke, Pak.
Are you able to share it for me?
Sure, Pak, sure.
Oh, there we go. Good. Right. So everyone can see that.
Yes, we can see the presentations.
Good. If we could move forward to the next slide, please. In fact, we can go forward to the next slide as well, I think, personally. So let me start by saying it's a pleasure, as always, to speak at Petromindo and Coal Asia events. I've been fortunate enough to be invited as a speaker on several occasions, and I always appreciate these opportunities. I was particularly interested in the carbon tax proposal because it raises so many intriguing issues that touch on finance, on the environment, on legal issues, and on taxation. A virtual feast for any consultant or lawyer in Indonesia. The carbon tax proposal was first included in the Ministry of Finance's 2022 macroeconomics framework and general fiscal policies. And to implement the carbon tax, an amendment to the 1983 tax law is going to be required. We now have a draft tax bill. It's been prepared jointly by the government and the DPR, and it's included in the prioritized national legislation program for 2021. And it's actually currently being deliberated by the DPR. If we can go to the next slide, please. The Ministry of Finance has claimed a variety of benefits from the carbon tax proposal. First, it said that it will result in a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions through reduced or more efficient fossil fuel use. The Ministry of Finance has also highlighted that the carbon tax would raise additional government revenue that can be used to fund environmentally friendly investments and improve the welfare of Indonesia's poor and vulnerable. Obviously, very worthwhile objectives. At the same time, the Ministry of Finance acknowledges that accompanying policies are required to strengthen the people's purchasing power and deal with unexpected impacts of the carbon tax. The next slide, please. What we know about the carbon tax proposal and how it will be implemented is to be found in Article 44G of the draft tax bill. This article is quite brief and is very short on detail. What we do know, though, is that the government is proposing both a demand side and a supply side tax. The demand side tax will seek to tax products that include carbon and are supplied to the Indonesian market. The supply side tax will seek to tax activity, industrial activity that generates greenhouse gas emissions. Other countries sometimes have just a demand side approach or a supply side approach. Indonesia is looking at addressing both the demand side and the supply side. We know, second, that initially the carbon tax tariff will be 75 rupiah per kilogram or 75,000 rupiah per ton of CO2 equivalent. Third, we know when it's proposed that the carbon tax will be collected and paid. On the demand side, it'll be the time of purchase of a product that is carbon rich. And on the supply side, it will be the end of a certain period of activity. So presumably every 6 months or every 12 months of activity that generates greenhouse gas emissions will result in an obligation to pay the carbon tax. Article 44G, though, leaves open the possibility of the payment point being at other times as well. So considerable flexibility in terms of when the carbon tax will be payable. Next slide, please. A lot is mentioned in Article 44G of the procedures for calculation and payment to be dealt with in one or more implementing regulations. And that's really all we know about how the carbon tax will be calculated and how it will be payable. It will all be dealt with in implementing regulations. And we're going to come back to that because it's really, that is really at the heart of my concerns about the carbon tax proposal. Article 44G also says that the stated purpose of the carbon tax will be to control greenhouse gas emissions to support the achievement of Indonesia's Paris Agreement nationally determined commitments to reduce greenhouse gases. Finally, Article 44G refers to the use that will be made of the carbon tax proceeds. Those proceeds will be used in part to facilitate climate change control. Now, that, ladies and gentlemen, is really all that is provided for in Article 44G, and accordingly, at this point in time, those 6 points are really all we know about the detail of the carbon tax and how it will be implemented. And therein lies the fundamental problem, I would suggest, and we'll come back to this in a little while. The next slide, if you would please, Parsanati. It's very interesting to look at what the various industry associations have said about the carbon tax proposal. And they certainly haven't been shy in making their concerns known. The Indonesian Employers Federation, APindo, has said that the carbon tax is a noble intention, but now is not the right time, APindo suggests. And APindo highlights the fact that industry needs time to accept the idea of a carbon tax. Essentially, there needs to be a period of socialization of the idea of a carbon tax. APindo also suggests that a carbon tax will be inflationary. And perhaps most importantly, and APindo says, look, a carbon tax really only makes sense if the government first provides industry with environmentally friendly, renewable energy alternatives. And this was a point that Parsanati made in his opening remarks, that renewable energy is still such a small part of the energy mix in Indonesia. Is it therefore reasonable to tax people for carbon products and activities that generate greenhouse gas emissions if you don't provide them with friendly, renewable energy alternatives? The next slide, please. The Indonesian Cement Association has also been quite vocal in its opposition to the carbon tax, suggesting that it's simply beyond the financial capacity of the cement industry to bear at this time. And ASI has put out a variety of financial statistics about the very difficult financial circumstances of the cement industry at this time. ASI has also suggested that a carbon tax would reduce the regional and global competitiveness of Indonesian cement products. Why? Because other regional and global competitors of Indonesia will not be subject to a carbon tax. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, ASI highlights what it says will be the burden to the public of a carbon tax. And we will come back to this point because I would suggest that this is a particularly politically sensitive issue that may well resonate in these difficult economic times. Finally, APBI, the Indonesian Coal Mining Association, has highlighted what it says will be a significant adverse impact on local industry and called for extensive discussion with relevant business actors. Now, of course, these are industry associations. They're there to promote the interests of their members. And so cynical people might say that these industry association objections and criticisms are self-serving. But I think that would be doing an injustice in this case to the industry associations. And we'll talk further about that in a moment. The next slide, please. Looking at the carbon tax proposal from an objective and dispassionate standpoint, it's very hard to deny that Indonesia needs to do a whole lot more to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Indonesia is the world's 8th largest emitter of greenhouse gases, accounting for 2% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, and as Parsanadi has already pointed out, coal still dominates the energy mix in Indonesia, being 66.3% for coal and only 15.6% for renewable energy in 2019. And the position has not changed dramatically since then. While the renewable energy contribution has undeniably increased during the period of 2015 to 2019, the reality is that the contribution of coal to Indonesia's energy mix has actually increased even more during the same period. So given these stark facts, it's hard to say, I would suggest, that Indonesia doesn't need to do something and do a whole lot more indeed than it's doing at the moment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Accordingly, the apparent attraction of the carbon tax is obvious in terms of targeting greenhouse gas emissions. The next slide, please. Likewise, it's almost impossible to deny that the Indonesian government needs to raise more revenue and quickly. The Indonesian government's fiscal deficit is projected to be 5.5% of GDP in 2021. And that's notwithstanding that it's legally mandated that the government get its fiscal deficit back to not more than 3% of GDP by 2023. How is it going to do that if it doesn't raise more revenue? At the same time, the Indonesian government's tax revenues have declined significantly since 2020 due to the economic recession that has accompanied the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, the government's costs of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic have kept rising almost exponentially. So again, in terms of the need to raise more revenue, it's almost impossible to deny that that is indeed the case. And therefore, once again, one can see the apparent attraction of a carbon tax in doing something about the government's parlous revenue position. The next slide, please, Pasanadi. Notwithstanding that Indonesia needs to do more about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the government needs to raise more revenue, the question is the carbon tax the right solution? And is it the right solution now? And herein lies the problem, ladies and gentlemen. We know so very little about the actual details of the implementation of the carbon tax. Accordingly, what I'd suggest is it's simply not good enough to say that a carbon tax proposal seems like a good idea. The carbon tax proposal is only likely to deliver the benefits highlighted by the Ministry of Finance if there is comprehensive advanced planning and extensive industry consultation. I was particularly taken by the fact that a senior executive of the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, was quoted in the press as saying that he hoped the Indonesian government would impose a big fat tax on carbon. That is such an inadequate response, I would suggest. Something far more and far more nuanced than a big fat tax on carbon is required if Indonesia is to get its carbon tax proposal right. The next slide, please.
Excuse me, Pak Bill.
Yes.
About 3 minutes, Pak Bill.
Okay. It's closely associated with this is we must acknowledge that the government has a very poor track record of implementing complex policies. And no one can deny that the carbon tax is a very complicated policy. The domestic processing and refining obligation in the mining industry provides an excellent example of what happens when complex policies become law without sufficient advanced planning and extensive industry consultation. Introduced in 2009, the domestic processing and refining obligation has proved a conundrum for the Indonesian government because there was insufficient planning and insufficient industry consultation. We must avoid a similar problem with the carbon tax. Next slide, please. I see a couple of serious obstacles to the carbon tax becoming law. First, we must recognize that one of the major greenhouse gas emitters in Indonesia are state-owned enterprises. The government has ultimate financial responsibility for state-owned enterprises, including PLN in the electricity space, Semen Gresik in the cement industry space, Krakatau Steel in the steel industry space, all major greenhouse gas emitters. Accordingly, the carbon tax is likely to become a major liability for PLN and other heavy industry state-owned enterprises. This will be a liability that the government itself is ultimately responsible for. More importantly, the government will collect no carbon tax revenue from PLN and other heavy industry state-owned enterprises. It will simply be offset by a reduction in the profitability of those companies. Next slide, thank you. Second, and perhaps even more importantly as an obstacle to the carbon tax becoming law, is the extra cost burden for Indonesia's already vulnerable population. The World Bank recently downgraded Indonesia from an upper middle income country to a lower middle income country. And since 2020, an increasing number of Indonesians have been falling into poverty. Regrettably, the previous excellent progress the government was making in poverty eradication is being reversed during this COVID-19 pandemic. Accordingly, I'd suggest the government may be very reluctant to add to the cost burden of an already vulnerable population. Next slide. Let me summarize and make a few conclusions here. Indonesia unquestionably needs to do much more to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. Likewise, it's unquestionably the case that the government needs to raise more revenue. Accordingly, the carbon tax proposal might be a solution to these and other problems. Whether or not, however, the carbon tax proposal is actually the solution Indonesia needs depends almost entirely on its implementation. Next slide. The government's poor past track record in implementing complex policies justifies much of the industry criticism, which might otherwise be thought to be self-serving. Industry, however, is surely right to be cautious about the carbon tax proposal, to request more consultation, and to want to know the implementation details before it supports the carbon tax. Next slide. The liability of state-owned enterprises for the carbon tax could greatly reduce the extra revenue generation benefit of the carbon tax for the government. Avoiding social unrest has been the government's primary concern throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, and it has influenced the government's policies all along in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Accordingly, the government may be concerned that it is politically unwise to introduce a carbon tax at this time, and even if it is an otherwise good idea. Accordingly, I think we need to be very cautious about the carbon tax and to have some significant reservations about whether the carbon tax will become law anytime soon in Indonesia. Next slide. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to speak with you today.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Bill Sullivan, Senior Foreign Counsel with Christianto and Partners and Senior Advisor for Stephenson Harwood LLP for the presentations. There are some points that might be in line with what Bu Putu has presented about the timing, unwise, the government still pushing to finalize the bill during we are still in the pandemic COVID-19. Okay, we'll get back to you later in the Q&A, Pak Bill. Thank you very much. Okay, next presenter, we gotta change a little bit order of the presenter for today. So Bu Liana
Yes.
sudah siap? Nah,
Ya,
okay, we are going
siap,
to
Pak.
listen presentation from Bu Liana Bratasida. Beliau Executive Director of Indonesian Association Pulp and Paper Association atau APKI. She's joining us from Singapore. Bu Liana has been in the industry for more than 10 years. She also used to work at the Ministry of Environment and also has been very keen in issue on carbon, climate change, and other environmental matters. Bu Liana Bratasida, silakan 15 minutes for the presentation. Bu Liana, silakan.
Thank you, Pak Hendra. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a big opportunity, a great opportunity for me to share a lesson learned on carbon pricing instrument design and implementation in other countries. But please allow me to turn off my video because sometimes the line will be not stable. Thank you. Yeah. So I start with my first slide. Who is the host for sharing my presentation, Pak Hendra? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Then the first slide, please. The first slide. Yeah. So the carbon pricing definition and instrument based on over the word few World Bank, OECD, etc. So they are defining or they are questioning what is carbon pricing. Carbon pricing and what is the most common types of instrument. But it is not the only instrument because there are other carbon pricing instruments available. So carbon pricing is one of many approaches to reduce emission by discouraging the use of technologies that emit CO2 and others greenhouse gases. Yeah. Then the central principle that we have to consider is that carbon pricing is built in the polluter pay principle. Yeah, that is the most important thing. And the most common types of carbon pricing is carbon tax, carbon trading or emission trading system, and baseline crediting mechanism or offset, we call it. And the most interesting is that other carbon pricing instrument like internal carbon price or shadow price. It is implemented like gold standard, usually used by the bankers to set an indicators, and they auction and business to prepare for carbon prices to rock for a certain price. This is one other example of instrument. And the other one is result-based climate change finance. Usually, this is the payments made by achieving agreed upon climate-related result, particularly reducing carbon emission. It is the result-based climate finance. The second slide, please. Now, this is the map, the carbon pricing map developed by World Bank. Then I tried to calculate how many countries that already implement or scheduled to implement carbon tax. There are 25 countries, and there are also 7 subnational jurisdictions in the world. That is for carbon tax. While for ETS, we have seen here 38 countries already implement or scheduled to implement, and there are also 28 subnational jurisdictions implement or scheduled to implement ETS. Third slide, the third. So I tried with the ASEAN country. Singapore is the first carbon tax, not carbon pricing, carbon tax that already fully implemented in ASEAN with the price or the charge of 5 Singaporean dollar, which is equal to $3.6 US, and will review post 2023. Yeah, and can you move to the next slide, please, and come back later to the. This is the carbon pricing mechanism in Singapore. How they prepare? They need almost 10 years to prepare this carbon tax. Yeah, with consultation with companies and also all stakeholders. Open public consultation is very important, particularly for companies or business that will use these taxes or will implement these taxes. Can you please come back to the first, the earlier slide, please? So this is only Singapore, while Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, Brunei Darussalam is starting with step-by-step approach. They are preparing guideline. They are preparing strategic plan for a certain region, economic corridors in Thailand. So the same case is in Vietnam. They first try to do it step by step. The pilot system is very important. Then they will start in 2025 and fully operation in 2027. So this is the illustration in ASEAN. So next to the China. In China, yeah. No, next one. In China, carbon pricing status in China. So we can see in China, they start in 2013. For 5 years, they are doing 6 subnational ETS pilot project with a different price based on the different region. The price is not equal everywhere. Yeah, and under 2019 and 2020, national carbon emission trading cap was set, yeah, by the government, but only for power generation industry first, not to all sectors. So this is also scoping which sector is the most important that ETS will be implemented. While in 2021, China power sector will be regulated. So the regulation will be in 2021. So we can see here very clearly, step-by-step approach, doing ETS or doing or strategy planning for carbon tax. Next. This is in South Korea. So South Korea also start with adoption of ETS. They start in 2020 by changing their emission trading act. So they have it earlier already, and they are previewing in 2021. Yeah, the government announced the ETS will change. So they are changing. Yeah, and then they are facing ETS for implementation, and they will set in 2021 with the price of $16 per ton CO2. India is also not starting yet. Japan adopts carbon tax nationally, yeah, but they are still in the process of reviewing and also planning the price, etc., because the government instruct MOE, Ministry of Economy, to discuss it, and also METI, and also Ministry of Environment to discuss it in 2021. While the subnational ETS program were implemented already with the starting price of $5 per ton CO2 in Saitama and also in Tokyo. Next. This is in North America. In Canada, they start carbon tax and ETS, yeah, with a certain price. And then gradually, the price will be increased. And they also implement at the subnational level, like British Columbia, Northwest Territories, Prince Edward Island, etc. So this is this is the implementation at subnational level, and there is a smooth transition, yeah, while they are implementing also the ETS or carbon tax, yeah. While in USA, nationally they don't have it, yeah, but in every federal they have it. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. Here we start with Washington, and they have a clean air rule. In January 2020, the Washington Supreme Court ruled that the Department of Ecology could regulate direct source of emission or stationary source of emission, but not indirect sources of emission. Then, in December 2020, the Climate Commitment Act for the 2021 was introduced, which proposed an economic-wide ETS for the state largest emitter. So there's always a scoping and time schedule. Yeah, the same as in Hawaii, in Massachusetts, and other federal area in the United States. I will not come into each federal area. So next slide. Carbon pricing in Latin America, in Colombia. Yeah, they start with carbon tax imposed on what? On energy use only, like gasoline, diesel, or other fuels used for transportation, stationary facilities, or heating. Yeah, with the tax also $5 per ton CO2 with adjustment for inflation, and then it become later to $10 per ton CO2. The same as in Mexico. Carbon tax started with a tax rate of 3.5 ton CO2. Yeah, and then there is also a subnational level. Carbon tax will come into effect in certain national level. for ETS. Next. In Europe and or New Zealand. New Zealand adopts ETS, yeah, while in Australia, they introduced the carbon pricing mechanism in 2012, yeah, based on the Clean Air Act, and then but because of complaint from all business and there is an injury to their economic development, then the system was withdrawn by the government. Yeah. Next. This is in Germany. So I don't want to elaborate one by one, but the approach in Europe is because they start with carbon tax and then they also implement emission trading scheme. It's already implemented since several years ago with a certain price and scope. Also, they extend the scope of the object or the subject of the proponent for charging the tax. Yeah. Next, this is Germany. It is United Kingdom. Yeah, more or less the same with different price. Also, next, it is Finland, Netherlands. So I don't want to come to one by one, but I will conclude later. So the approach is more or less the same in Europe. Next. Now, this is the most important thing that I would like to share. Starting from 14 July 2021, European Union or European Commission introduced what they call it Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism or CBAM, with the purpose to prevent the risk of carbon leakage, to support the EU ambition of carbon mitigation and ensuring WTO compatibility. Yeah, the system will start, yeah, in 2023 and will be phased and will be initially gradually will be phased and then gradually apply, yeah, to a more extent sector starting in 2023 with initial scope for cement, iron, steel, fertilizer, aluminium, and electricity. Yeah, and then later they will extend to other products and services covering direct and indirect emission. So all products or goods that are coming to Europe, yeah, shall have a certificate. Certificate by importers, yeah, is necessary. Then they will calculate the carbon, yeah, the carbon that being emitted by the product when they are producing the product, and they will calculate, yeah, by comparing with the EU price. So then the CBAM will provide restitution scheme of carbon tax if non-EU producer have already paid carbon price equal to what they have done. It is in 2026. And then in 2030, then all importers need to pay the same carbon price as domestic producer under EU ETS scheme. So this is mandatory. Like we have SVLK, for example, that already exists. This program or this mechanism is being created by EU in order to achieve what they have set already in EU Green Deal, with the target of emission reduction to be reduced for 55% in 2030, and they will achieve carbon neutral in 2050. The interesting point here that other countries like USA, Canada, Japan also planning similar initiative, while in California already implementing to certain import of electricity. So this is a mandatory scheme later on that will be implemented. in 2000, starting in 2023, but later you will have to follow as a mandatory regulation. Next.
Oke, Bu.
This is the interesting.
Menit lagi, Bu.
Yeah, this is the interesting that already presented by Bill. So I don't want to elaborate in more detail for the RUKP. And the interesting one is that there is already a draft of presidential decree. Therefore, I'm very curious, or I would like to have question further to Ibu Putu that already informing us that the carbon pricing will be regulated in the form of presidential decree. Is that decree, presidential decree that we are discussing now, or is there any other presidential decree? That is one point. Secondly, the carbon tax. What will happen with the article of carbon tax and RUU KUP that already discussed in the parliament? Yeah, this is what I would like to ask Bu Putu. Yeah, next. I don't know. This is the regulation existing. My message is how that we can coordinate, or implement in synchronization and standardize to prevent overlapping. Don't make making companies doing so many effort or having double taxation in achieving Indonesia NDC and LDC target. Next. This is the important thing that my message is this, that the presidential decree that we are developing cannot be separated with the discussion what is already happening in Paris Agreement, because in Paris Agreement there is ITMO, internationally transfer mitigation action, that need to be reported. So what my message here, that there are so many initiatives internationally that need to be considered in our development of the presidential decree related with the carbon pricing. Next, this is the conclusion, Pak Hendra and all Pak Ibu. Therefore, key design consideration for developing carbon pricing in Indonesia is that we have to define carbon that combusted and generates CO2 emission, or the whole greenhouse gases, and you have to convert to CO2 equivalent. This is one point. The scoping approaches, which approach you want to do, fuel approach or direct emission approach, because the responsibility is different. Yeah, the approach also being tackled in different way. The mechanism, Bill also mentioned many things. Developing a roadmap. This is very important, with a simple, transparent, inclusive way, involving all relevant stakeholders through a national, through the academic and regulatory study, and using step-by-step approaches with low transitional rate to give time to adjust, improve, and review gradually by taking into account national economic development, competitiveness, as well as international mechanism scheme, like for example in Singapore. The second point is readiness of infrastructure to implement carbon pricing. There is national registration scheme, but we have also so many. We have CINAS in the Ministry of Industry. We have what we call it in ESDM also for reporting. Yeah, there are so many reporting schemes that the business need to be followed. Why we don't have one system for reporting? Then the carbon pricing scheme may consist of ETS, offset carbon tax, and resource-based payment. Those instruments are complementary to each other and should not be treated as a standalone instrument. Meanwhile, carbon pricing policy also need to be consistent and in line with other systems or regulation to achieve greenhouse gas emission reduction target, what is stated in NDC. Then I also mentioned energy transition, including increased renewable energy utilization and coal-phase mechanism, are key measures to meet the NDC and paves the way forward to net zero emission. Start at a low transitional price to give business industry time to make adjustment and improvement. Next, there are two more. Then this is the revenue that we are discussing. Yeah, Pak Bill also already mentioned earmarking or non-earmarking. Because actually, Bapak Ibu, we have already Undang-Undang 28 tahun 2008 mengenai PDRD, di mana in this law 28 2008, Article 8.5 already mentioned about the motor vehicle tax revenue. It is charged minimum 10%. And also in Article 31, we have cigarette tax revenue. Yeah, so there is already an earmarking system actually, not clearly, but there is already exists there. So revenues from carbon pricing in principle should be allocated to support activities or efforts to reduce carbon emission and in the larger scope to repair environmental damages. So my question is, key consideration, I have several questions. What are the policy objectives the government seeks to achieve with the instrument? What are relevant legal regulation, governance process, resources and capacities? What is the level of support among the involved stakeholders? And which sector and technology should be covered for the first time? Yeah. So this is my sharing or my view based on the lesson learned for other countries. And my last slide is the CDM. Is there any slide? No? Okay.
Iya, waktunya Bu,
Yeah.
mohon maaf, udah habis.
This is the way forward. I think with that, I end my presentation, and I hope my message to Ibu Putu is very clear. I just heard today, Bu Putu, therefore I have a question, how about the carbon tax and the RUU KUP? Because you just mentioned that you will discuss the carbon pricing in Indonesia will be in the form of presidential decree. With that, thank you very much for your attention.
Oke, thank you. Terima kasih Bu Liana Bratasida, Executive Directors Indonesian Pulp and Paper Associasi. Terima kasih for the presentation. There are some of questions that will be addressed directly to Bu Putu, and then ya nanti di Q&A Bu Putu akan merespon. Okay, we move to the next presenter, Pak Ali Mardi, tax partner from Deloitte Solutions. The topic banking or financing perspective or the planned carbon tax in Indonesia. Pak Ali Mardi, silakan Pak, waktunya kalau bisa lebih cepat, silakan.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Hendra. Oke, saya usahakan Pak waktunya Pak.
Ya, silakan Pak.
Let me share my screen ya, screen. Sudah kelihatan belum Pak?
Iya, kelihatan Pak Ali, silakan.
Oke, mungkin saya ini pointernya dulu ya. Oke, pertama terima kasih, thank you to Petromendo and Coal Asia for having me as one of the panelists here. It's very interesting topic ya, and new topic as well for most of us here because we don't have this carbon tax regime in Indonesia previously. So what I want to put here, so because previously the presenter already explained some of the aspect, I will not repeat that again. I will just go quickly because for the interest of time. I just want to show here, if we're talking about the fuel side, the coal side or mineral mining side, we need to understand as well that the coal sector and mining sector is very unique in terms of its fiscal regime. It's been taxed separately by the government because we have a separate regime here. For example, because this is talking about natural resources, we have the royalty system in Indonesia, which is usually calculated based on the production or the sales of the commodity itself. And it's really depending on the price. This percentage for coal, for example, that's is calculated from the revenue adjusted with certain logistic deduction. So you can see even within coal, there are various rates there for IUPs and for contract of work. And another thing is what interesting is that for certain type of license, they even have specific levy by additional levy by the government. For IUP-KOP license, they have 10% of net profit on top of this royalty they already pay. And that's all non-tax, we call it PNBP, non-tax state revenue. That's on top of the state revenue they usually pay. Yeah, so that's what we need to consider as well when considering this carbon tax. For the income tax itself, we can see that for certain company, generally company will pay 20% going forward from next year, especially for IUP. But when we are dealing with a contract of work company, they pay for whole contract of work, they pay income tax up to 45% from their net profit. So it's quite specific regime in here. And they also have the VAT implication, withholding tax on dividend, return to the shareholder, and specific rules on land and building tax. So in respect of mining, if we're talking about mining itself, then mostly the emission will come from electricity generation or use of electricity, either by fuel or if they have a captive power plant. And then fuel consumption, usually this is quite big in mining because they have a lot of heavy equipment and other equipment. If they have downstream processing, which is mandated by the mining law, of course, then this also needs a lot of fuel and energy, right? So emission here is quite large as well. Next is about logistic. They have hauling, barging, transshipment, all using fuel usually. So this is an area that will be impacted in general by this carbon tax. So this one explain about this proposed carbon tax. I will not go too detail with that because it's been explained by the previous speaker, right? But the current carbon tax is embedded into the proposed change to the general tax procedures and provision law. I agree with Buliana. It will be interesting to hear from Ibu Putu if there's other mechanism like the carbon trading later on be introduced under presidential decree, how this carbon tax will work together with the carbon trading then under the presidential regulations. So this one also been explained by Pak Bill, but what I want to note here is that under the proposed draft bill, the tax subject is an individual or an entity here, right? And then that purchase goods containing carbon, this is what Ibu Liana explained as a fuel approach, I think just now in the previous presentation, and or producing carbon emission. This is the emission approach then. So the law itself actually allow the two method being implemented because this is an or, right? So under the draft law itself, the government have the flexibility where to put the tax or where to impose the tax, whether upon the transaction, sell or purchase of fuel, for example, or based on the emission then. And then the tax object is the purchase itself, if this is a fuel approach, or activities that emit the certain quantity of carbon. This is the emission approach then. We discussed about the rate already. I will not go too detail in there, but this slide I think is important. So this slide was taken from the naskah academic draft of the RUU KUP. Yeah. So in this naskah academic, the government estimate the total income they may receive from carbon tax. One side is the income for the government, but the other side is, of course, the aim to fulfill the NDC under the Paris Agreement, which is very important as well. So this is only seeing it from the potential government revenue, which is mainly from the power plant, pembangkit listrik. Sorry, this is not, this is in bahasa. Pembangkit listrik is power plant. They use the consumption, national consumption, and then estimate the carbon emission, and then apply the tariff to come up with the expected state income they will receive with this implementation of the carbon tax. So the three main area here is the IPP or a power plant, not just IPP, but including PLN. And then industry, from industry, they expect 10 trillion from there. And then from the transportation or logistics sector, is also expected to regenerate from the land and sea transportation. They expect quite a big amount as well there. Yeah. So what this translate actually, because as a non-technical person, I only see 75 rupiah per kg or around $5, $6 per ton, right? So if we see from the calculation here, what we can say is that for every 1 ton of coal being burned at the power plant, right, the emission is around 2 tons of CO2. Yeah, this is a very simplified mechanism I got from this calculation. I concluded from this calculation here. So meaning that for every 1 ton of coal being burned at power plant, the additional cost for carbon tax is $10, around $10.8. And this is the table below show what happened with the land and sea transportation. So for every kiloliter of fuel use, the carbon tax is around $13. Yeah, and since this tax was not there, it's not there currently, this will be an additional cost for the players involved, of course. So the bottom one shows the implementation carbon tax in various countries. I think this already explained very good by Buliana, yeah, just now, how each country, every country implemented the carbon tax or carbon trading. So I will not go too far with this then. This one is the key question based on what I see from the regulation. Agree with Pak Bill that the law is very brief. Even the naskah academic, the draft academic is mainly focusing on the why this carbon tax should be implemented. But the how is not there yet because it said in the draft regulation, it will be implemented through a Minister of Finance regulations, right? So if you see from this, the question will be the mechanism to collect, whether it's product purchase or emission. The law makes the government allow the government to do the two approach here, which is the fuel approach, product purchase, or the emission. But the question is then in Indonesia, usually the party bearing the cost could be different to the party that is obliged to collect, for example, a remit to the state treasury. So what's in more detail, the mechanism here then? That's the question. Because if the coal company, for example, when they sell the product, they need to collect, they will put more burden, more admin burden. And if they didn't comply, for example, of course, there's always penalty for the mining company, for example, right? So this is something to consider. And then as explained previously as well, what's going to be the reporting details and procedures to make sure that it is efficient and the government can get whatever information necessary for them, right? Another thing is very important here about group relief. In Indonesia, if you're talking about tax, because this carbon tax is combined under the tax law, right? It's under the tax provisions, right? In Indonesia, we don't have tax, the so-called tax consolidation like in other countries. So if you have a business, for example, also having a carbon reserve because you have a forestry business there, you turn certain X mining area into a forest that producing oxygen, for example, you have carbon reserve there. Can you then offset the CO2 then with that? It's similar to the pricing of trading mechanism, but looks like under this carbon tax, what being proposed, there's no group relief in here. So for example, PLN, they have a lot of coal-fired power plant, but at the same time, they have big geothermal operation as well, right? More renewables, green energy there, some hydro as well. The question is that, could that be an offset mechanism there or not, right? A carbon credit mechanism, carbon trading mechanism there. And then next key consideration here is, of course, monitoring, how the government will monitor the implementation to make sure this is fair for everyone and have a level playing field. Yeah. What will be the verification? If this is based on emission, which body will be eligible to do the certification, for example, or to do an audit on the company? In Singapore, for example, they already implement carbon tax, right? Singapore already has a list of certain bodies. They are allowed to do the certification of the emission. So these are the technical party that can verify and then put certification. So when they calculate the carbon tax, there will be a reliable source on what's the emission prepared by each company. So it's sort of like an audit, for example. And then the next question is always, whenever you have a tax there, you're talking about compliance, right? What happened with the non-compliance then, right? So in the draft law, it says that the administration, the tax rights and obligation of the taxpayer related to this carbon tax will follow the current tax law, right? The provision of the KUP law, meaning that there will be penalty for non-compliance, interest penalty. And if you have a dispute, for example, you may go to the tax court to resolve them in that case. And we all know the tax court tax dispute process in Indonesia is not easy. One of the most difficult jurisdiction in respect of tax dispute resolution process. So that's also a question then, how this then will impact the company. So when we're talking about PLN, I did a very high level, yeah, and just out of curiosity, I did a very high level back of the envelope calculation. What's the impact to PLN? Yes, we know, like Pak Bill explained, for PLN, dividend will go to government. Government provides subsidy as well for the electricity tariff to the household or residential. Yes, we know that, but I just want to show here in this slide that PLN consume around 66 million tons of coal, right, every year for 2020. I took it from their annual report. So if you see if you do a simplified calculation here based on the Naskah academic, then the carbon tax in trillion is 10 trillion, or equal to 700 million US dollar, yeah, equivalent to US dollar. Yeah. So if you see that PLN annual report for 2020, their profit is only around 5 trillion rupiah. So this carbon tax is twice their profit actually. So what's the consequence of this? So if you see this slide show as well that, like Hendra explained, coal is still a very important energy mix nationally, and even for PLN. This table show for PLN, you still have 63% of the energy mix using coal, right? And PLN main customer, apart from industry, also residential here. If you see majority of the electricity produced goes to residential, and some of them, this is where the subsidy came from the government, right? And industry also is followed by the industry and the business here. Yeah, when we are talking about subsidy, yes, it's impact the residential, but I don't think there's any subsidy for the industry and the business, right? Meaning that if the cost of PLN increase due to this carbon tax, some of them will go probably to subsidies from the government. Some of them will probably need to be borne by the industry or the business, because they simply need to unpass that, right? And if you see from here, PLN saw the profits saw determined by the coal price, right? So if you see the average coal price here, yeah, is for 2020, the price of coal is quite low actually, the blue line here. But today coal price is already 130, right? In August, the HBA, the price benchmark is already 130. Despite it is being capped at $70 for PLN, this will still mean an increase in fuel cost for PLN before the VAT introduced under the Omnibus Law, and even before this carbon tax. So the question is then how to alleviate the impact then? What's the plan to alleviate the impact? Yeah, this is a slide I just want to show the impact to PLN. Of course, PLN got bonds and things like that, need to consider what's the implication to them. And then for mining company, the impact I explained before mainly come from their emission. But what we need to be aware of, when the fuel price increase, there could be again negotiation with PLN, of course, on the coal price, which will later put the pressure on the mining company, right, in terms of their coal sales to PLN. So that's need to be considered further for the mining company. And then this is to show what's the impact to a logistic company. I took one listed shipping company very quickly. The increase in carbon tax is around 3% of their net profit, net taxable profit. So that's some impact as well then. So this is the last slide I've got. The question for the government as well, because I couldn't find it from the draft academic and Naskah academic, but of course there's an increase in energy costs for sure. That will maybe on pass to the industry, right? If the government want to put a subsidy to the electricity price, then it will reduce or offset the revenue they expect to get from PLN, right? So how effective it is then to achieve the aim to get more revenue then? That's the question. How much you can get from this? That's apart from the NDC we want to achieve, of course, the reduction in emission. Yeah? But this increase of cost in energy will of course goes to industry, for example, and industry then will need to increase the price because there's cost of energy increase, right? So their product will be less competitive compared to their peer who don't pay the carbon tax, for example. And then the question is again, even if the government give a subsidy to the electricity, what about the other staple goods then that needed by the low income people then? What form of subsidy the government can give out of this revenue, the carbon tax revenue, to alleviate the impact to the poor people then? This is very important because as we discussed before, this is a big tax then if we want to do a subsidy there. Yeah. The second or last but not least is about carbon leakage. We already discussed that industry may move their production facility to other country with no carbon tax because it's cheaper to do so, for example, make Indonesia less attractive, for example, right? So how we should, the government then do other aspect to improve the investment climate then because of this carbon tax. The CBAM, the carbon border adjustment, has been discussed by Ibu Liana. I will not discuss further on that, but even the EU, it took them some time to do this then. So that's the question I think need to be addressed. Hopefully this can address the concern then, I think give some question as well to the government. And Mbak Putu is here for, hopefully government already considered all of this, yeah, in their study then. That's it, Pak, my presentation for this carbon tax.
Thank you very much, Pak Ali Mardi, tax partner of Deloitte Solution, for the very informative and very insightful in presentations. Yeah, there are a lot of factors to be considered, yeah, Pak Ali Mardi. Carbon leakage is very interesting one, yeah, because yeah, there's in ASEAN country itself, as Bu Liana mentioned, only Singapore that has implemented carbon tax, and other ASEAN countries, especially Vietnam, which is Indonesian, one of Indonesian main competitor in Southeast Asia.
Correct, Pak.
So there will be highly, possibility that some industry might be moved to those countries. Okay, thank you very much, Pak Ali. We'll get back to you in the Q&A sessions. Okay, the next presenters, Pak Dendi, ya, Pak Dendi Ramdhani, economist at Bank Mandiri. Pak Dendi has written numerous articles in the various newspaper in Indonesia, including the latest one in the Jakarta Post, yeah, about the carbon tax. So please, Pak Dendi Ramdhani, for your time. Kalau bisa lebih cepat, lebih bagus, Pak Dendi. Silakan.
Okay, thank you, Pak Hendra. And also thank you for the invitation, Petromindo, Pak Dianto, dan Bu Desi. So I think as the last speaker, almost issue have been explained and discussed by the previous speaker. So probably I will not spend so much time, but there is some important issue that has not been discussed. I think yeah, in general, we have similar concern to the other speakers. But one thing that maybe we should highlight that, yeah, of course, we have a target to follow or to comply the Paris Agreement. Yeah, but remember that Indonesia, it has been also mentioned by Pak Bill. Yeah, we are number 8 as a contributor of the emissions in the global. But in terms of number, it's only 2.03%. Of course, it's much less than advanced countries. Yeah. And also, if we compare to the, let's say, forests, tropical forests, rainforests, and coral we have, I think we should also calculate the neutralization process. Yeah. So, I mean, some carbon, I think it has been cleaned up, yeah, by the rainforest. So in terms of the national level, I think the government should also consider this, yeah, that we have a lot of rainforest as a bargaining to make Indonesia bargaining power much powerful, yeah, in global negotiations. So what I want to say is that, of course, we have to set up this carbon tax mechanism based on our economic interests, yeah, including, for example, our national competitiveness. I think that's what I want to say. Yeah, everything should be considered based on our national interests, and of course, yeah, our country now starting to enforce the carbon initiative, yeah, and also one thing that we should pay more attention to cross-border tax, yeah, and also yeah, we should avoid the double taxation, yeah. If Indonesia has charge tax, whether it can be calculated when some exporters send their product to Europe, for example, yeah, how to make the clearance in this issue. And also, I think we know that the energy is the largest contributor, yeah, by sector. And one thing that we should also understand that we have a challenge in growing renewable energy. We have a target to grow the renewable energy, but at the same time, we know the challenge is that the investment cost is much higher, yeah, for renewable energy compared to the coal, yeah, and also in terms of the cost per kilowatt hour. So the energy pricing, investment policy, and also carbon initiative, yeah, that's three factors that should be designed to grow the renewable energy. So my concern, I think it has been discussed many times, but I again that want to highlight that, of course, yeah, the first question is how is the mechanism, yeah, the mechanism, and also who is managing the revenue pool, whether it will be, it has been mentioned that, yeah, we have a BEL, yeah, that manage this fund, yeah, so probably the models like BPDP Sawit, yeah, for the CPO. That's, I think that's a good example how the revenue collection, yeah, from the export tax of the CPO, and then they manage to aim specific goals in CPO sector. So I think that's very important if we replicate this model, yeah. So the use of revenue from the carbon tax or carbon initiative, I think it should be specific, yeah, to fix the environmental damage or to subsidize renewable energy. I think, yeah, because the renewable energy is much higher now, the price and also the investment cost, so probably it's kind of cross subsidy from the fossil fuel power plant, yeah, like the coal, and also the money should also spend for the reforestation or coral reef reforestation, and also to compensate indigenous people. So what I want to say is that the specific goal is should be clearly stated, yeah, because yeah, it's a bit mixed, yeah. If you are looking at the government, it seems not very clear how to spend it, because of course there are some spending, the current spending or before can be claimed as the as a program to reduce the carbon or to fix the environment. But probably in this case, we should really distinguish and to classify what the program that really aim at the as a part of to neutralize the carbon. And I think I bring much more question here than the idea how to solve. I think we have a lot of questions here. The first one is the how much is the right carbon pricing? Yeah, this is very important. Yeah, of course. Yeah, if we charge too high, it can reduce the competitiveness of industry, or it can be additional costs that make Indonesia less attractive than other countries. Yeah, what is the philosophy behind the pricing? We have already that probably the price 75,000, but what is the reason or philosophical background for this price? And also whether the price will be flat or progressive. I think progressive should be a good idea, yeah, because the more you produce carbon, you should pay more tax, yeah, as an incentive, as disincentivize to people to reduce the carbon they produce, yeah. And also the whether we charge in the upstream or in the downstream, yeah. Yeah, for example, in the electricity, whether you charge in to the miner or to PLN, yeah, or power planter, or to the consumers. So I think it should be considered very carefully, and also it has impact. It could be different, yeah, and also the mechanism of the carbon tax implementations, yeah. And also, as I mentioned before, yeah, which government institution? Personally, I prefer the model like a BPDP sawit, yeah. I think it's more specialized and more focused, yeah. And also, yeah, how should we allocate? Yeah, in my opinion, it should be allocated to fix the environment or any effort to reduce the carbon or environmental damage. Yeah, and when should we start? Yeah, I think that's a big question. Yeah, gradually or apply to all sector at the same time. In my opinion, it should be gradually. Yeah, gradually, and also very smooth. Yeah, to make it not disturbing the economy, especially in our condition now because of the economic crisis as an impact of the COVID pandemic. Yeah, and the last one is how can we coordinate with other countries globally? Yeah, because this is the international issue. I think it's also very important. Yeah, so if we charge too high, yeah, so it's very simply that our product will be much more expensive or more expensive. Yeah, if other countries do not charge, for example, our competitors. Yeah, let's say for the textile product, our competitor is Vietnam. If they don't charge the same rate, I think we'll lose our competitiveness. So that's very important, and also we should make coordination with the EU, for example, yeah, because they charge for imported product coming from other countries. And yeah, the last one, I think, in relation to our perspective in banking sector, I think yeah, banks or any banks, yeah, I think will always support the profitable project, yeah, including mining or energy, yeah. As long as the project is profitable, I think a bank will be very happy to support. And yeah, of course, the project should comply to the environmental regulations and common norm related to environment in the world, including carbon-related concern currently, yeah. And as you know, that banks are legally binding to comply the government regulation, yeah, such as Ministry of Forestry, Ministry of Finance, and also OJK. Yeah. We have a financial sustainable finance program now in the financial sector. And the last one, banks also controlled by a critical shareholder. Yeah. Some investors are very critical to environment. That makes bank very carefully, yeah, when they are supporting a loan to any project. Probably that's all, Pak Hendra. Thank you very much. You are still muted, Pak.
Pak Hendra, your voice.
We cannot hear your voice.
Yeah, hello.
Okay, yeah, that's
Okay.
good.
Sorry, I use earphone. I thought, but yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Pak Dedi Ramdhani, for the presentations. Very informative. Apparently, there are still a lot of homeworks should be done by government, yeah, before imposing the carbon tax, yeah. So I think we'll discuss it later in the Q&A. Ladies and gentlemen, we still have a very limited time, running out of time actually, but we still have one more panelist, Pak Hari Kristiono from Medco Energy. Pak Hari, mungkin bisa very quick, Pak Hari, 5 minutes maybe, because we were taking.
I will.
Yeah,
Yes,
Pak Hari.
actually.
Yes, silakan, Pak.
Thank you, Pak Hendra. So actually, I have another only 6. So just make a bottom line is for the another 5 speaker before. So actually, this is the minor perspective that actually we already talked internally in the association with the Pak Hendra, and we already having giving letter of with Kadin and with Apindo to the government that we need to discuss again, and we are reluctant to get the carbon tax, and yeah, that is the minor perspective. Okay, that's so this is the Indonesian energy mix that based on number 1 is scenario business as usual. So business as usual still using coal until 2006, but in the right side is with zero emission. So the coal will be elapsed in 2040. So 2050 will be based on the we call it nuclear and renewable energy. And renewable energy is come from the solar panel and wind, and also the PLTA. So this is for the that existing renewable energy that we have to flow. So this is that Indonesian energy mix. And if you come back to the philosophy of the coal itself, if the energy transition plan included in until 2040, 2050, I mean, so after that, as we try to now impose the carbon tax, it means we will cut all the tree, we will cut all the even the leaf, even the we call it the branches. So even the tree, because if you see in the product padat is a solid state, so that noise will be using for fuel, is for the power plants, and also for me is reductant coal for smelter, for cements, and another is for the steel making, for the coking coal. So it's mean if we put carbon tax in the coal, it's mean all the branches, even all the tree will be gone, and we will not support the transition of energy plan in 2050. And another slide is, if we see this picture, we can imagine Pak Alimadi already calculate about the loss in the PLN, and also some.
We lost you, Pak Chris. Hello. Halo. Pak Chris, Pak Dianto.
Halo Pak Chris, ya.
We lost Pak Chris. Can you contact Pak Chris, please?
Yes, contact.
Okay. Yeah, while we're waiting for Pak Chris to join us again, we have very limited time. So Pak Adianto and Bu Desi, we ask you permission to continue the sessions until at the latest 4:15 ya, paling lambat banget ya.
Yes, Pak. We can continue to the questions.
Yeah. Okay, Pak Chris will be joining us later. Okay, please ask Pak Chris to hold later. I'll let him rejoin again, yeah, to continue his presentation. so we can make use time very efficiently. Okay, we have several questions in the chat column. First is from Pak Kelvin. Yeah, Pak Kelvin's asking about the involvement of industry association, especially Steel Association, ICIA, and I already responded through column chat, and I believe ICIA has.
Hello, I'm come back. Yes, Pak. Sorry.
Sorry, we lost you a couple of minutes. Can you
Yeah.
can I continue a little bit? Sorry, Pak. Okay, I just answered responded question from Pak Kelvin. He asking question on the involvement of the Steel Association, and I told Pak Kelvin that ICIA, or the Steel Association, already attended the meeting together with other association with the Ministry of Finance. And Indonesia, to implement ETS, based on presentation from Bu Putu, yeah, Indonesian government is drafting a presidential regulation on nilai ekonomi carbon, so that will be used as a legal ground for the ETS. Okay, Pak Chris, please continue. 2 minutes, please, very quick, Pak, very quick.
Yeah, thank you. So that the carbon tax itself, it will be affected heavily is in the power viewing by Pak Ali Mardi, and the other is that, do not forget, is that like energy hungry, like for the smelter of the nickel, aluminum, and steel. So it will be make not only the carbon itself for especially they're using coal, they will be affected to the downstream of the mineral, and also that the carbon tax itself will be diminished. The diminish of the viability of the downstream core downstream plant, like put like DMA or coal gasification or whatever, that ammonia, urea, whatever that we are developed. So it's mean one department and one ministry with another ministry cannot like having some coordination. One ministry having tried to taking coal for the downstream side, and the other try to increase the revenue or to talk about the environment. So it means we are very confused about this situation. All life aspect until now, until 2050, is still related with the fossil fuel. And this is that we are talking about the carbon tax definition that have to determine from the not fugitive emissions, such as from the I call it for overburden removal or coal getting, but come from the emission from when the fuel facility burning. So it's mean it's more not more strictly can be calculated. And that's the conclusion that we see. The postponed carbon tax is, I think we have to postpone until we have a management or tata kelola already in place, because carbon tax cannot as the single instrument. They have to including like verifications like offtake and ETS and another instrument. So it means we have to talk again about the carbon taxes. Number one is definition of emission, the coal producing or fossil fuel forming activity. Number two is utilization facility that we already use and will be increased until P50 or P70. You have to calculate as the determine for the, we call it the low carbon effort. And number three is baseline study of about the 75 kilogram CO2 equivalent after discussion. Otherwise, will be impact our coal competitiveness to other coal production country like Australia not put the carbon tax. So we have to think about that. Number four is carbon tax will be imposed the energy price and will be affected to the, we call it a public burden, and we will make coal downstream plant not viable anymore. And number five is avoid a double tax that we see in the existing now. We already having carbon tax in the synonym of the PPNKB. we got tax for the heavy vehicles, and also fuel tax. And also we have like a PNDP forestry that already mentioned, said by Pak Ali Mahdi. So we have a lot of burden for the government revenue, and this is another revenue again. So why they cannot like make a definition? We already pay carbon tax using a PPNKB or PKB or pajak kendaraan. So why not just a redefinition using taxonomy? So this is, we can show to the external for the world or the European, but we already have followed the tax. And number 6, and at the end of the day, is set up incentive system, because actually mining is, we already tried to use renewable energy using solar cell, using winds, and we already good mining practice, and we put energy management with ISO 500 with 5001, and we already put the dust rehabilitation and reclamation. We call it, this is a enviro cost that we call it the sunk cost that we put it to rehabilitate the company, rehabilitate the enviro, and we put it as an incentive system. So I think it's a 6 slide that we are put that by Indra, and thank you very much, Indra.
Thank you, Pak Chris. Sorry for interrupting you. The time is constraint is our issue now. So thank you very much for the presentation. Your issue is a very straightforward, Pak Chris. Yeah. So I'd like to address directly to Bu Putu Oka Kusuma Wardani from Badan Kebijakan Fiskal. Bu Putu masih, are you still joining us, Bu Putu?
Yes, Pak.
Yeah.
Still here, Pak Indra.
Bu Putu, thank you, Bu Putu, for joining us. I believe you have listened all the presentations. There are too many issues addressed mostly to policy making side. So if you would like to answer maybe some of them, or maybe later in another occasion you can answer the other occasion, please. So it's yours. Pilih beberapa isu yang mau dijawab sekarang. Silakan Bu Putu.
Okay, Pak Hendra, and thank you for all the speakers. For I take notes every concerns that has been raised. And I think some of them are quite similar, especially when the question is raised about when the carbon tax will be implemented effectively. And like you mentioned before, in principle, we're not going to implement a carbon tax in the near future. We will take into considerations the right timing, especially with regards to the process of economic recovery. So this will take into account greatly. So for this reason, the discussions, in-depth discussions will be continued in order to prepare a more comprehensive policy and also involving the stakeholders, relevant stakeholders. I know that many speakers hoping that they can be involved in the discussions, but the KUP bill, the existing bill or the revisions of the law, it provides only a regulatory frameworks for the big skeleton, if you notice, which later will still need to be detailed again when we would like to implement in the implementation space through the implementing regulations. So the room for discussions and input is still wide open. But I can say that the carbon tax focuses. I remember that there is a question maybe raised by Mr. Biel. How much? What is expected? What is the objective of introducing the carbon tax? Well, actually, the carbon tax itself focuses in minimizing the impact of negative externalities on the environment from activities that create carbon emissions. So in this case, the revenue is not the main goal. So when you're asking about how much is the expected revenue and things like that, that would be another thing, but it's not the main priority for the government. The main focus is to reduce the negative externalities in terms of the environment preservations. And the implementations of the carbon tax will be accompanied by relevant policies that hopefully can reduce the economic and also the social impact and also optimize the benefit. I think aligned with the concern raised by Pak Chris just now, the implementations of the carbon tax will also take into considerations the alignment with various taxes on carbon consumptions that actually has been carried out in various forms. For example, we have a central tax in the form of luxury tax for motor vehicles, whose large taxes are also linked to engine capacity, which is relevant to the CO2 emissions level. And also at the local tax level, we know that there is a motor vehicle tax, which is indirectly linked to the impact of the environmental pollutions due to the use of the motorized vehicles and things like that. So the implementations of the carbon tax will, of course, need to pay attention to harmony with all the those tax collections practices. And the implementations of the carbon tax, I think we know that in various countries and also the plan to implement CBAM in the European Union, as comprehensively explained by Ibu Liana, it shows that in the end, the industry should anticipate the global developments, where the world is already moving towards the low carbon development. So the condition with those facts, the conditions of differences or distortions in competitiveness, it actually has occurred. Although it doesn't directly affect the business of companies that only operate in Indonesia. So in fact, financial institutions, some of them has begun to reduce financing for projects related to a high carbon involvement in the activities, or we can say carbon intensive activities. And among the advantages of implementing the carbon tax is also to overcome the applications of the CBAM, considering that the CBAM has an interactive feature of carbon levies that has been paid in the country of origin of products entering the AU market. So I think this is also another point of view that we need to digest, we need to consider more in the future. However, the government, of course, will try to, as much as possible, ensure that the transitions to a green economy is just and affordable. Just in this case, mean paying attention to the aspect of fairness to all parties, especially for the vulnerable groups of people, while affordable in terms of the required investment, technology transfer, and things like that. So based on our discussions today, I think everyone understand and agree that carbon tax is not the only solutions to the problems of gas rumah kaca reductions in Indonesia. But the carbon tax will support main existing climate change policy to push more reductions of the carbon emissions to achieve the NDC target. So MOF, I think in this regard, like Pak Hendra mentioned before, Ministry of Finance have discussed the proposal with several industry associations and is open to public consultations. For example, the discussions has been done with the associations under APindo, including GAPMI, INAPLAS, APKI, APLSE, AP, and also ASAKI and things like that. I think you recall that moment. But I mentioned before, the room for discussion is still wide open in the future. So I think we can continue this in the going forward. And regarding the tariff, I recall that there are questions on that. Currently, several countries still apply a single tariff, and what the company pays is in accordance with the number of products containing carbon being emitted. With the proposed tax rate, actually, in the KUP bill, it does it doesn't close the opportunity to do the adjustment on the tariff. It mentions that the minimum tariff is 75 rupiah, but it can be adjusted through further regulations like the presidential regulations. But for example, with the proposed tax rate, higher carbon emitter could pay higher taxes. And I think in this regard, fairness could somehow be reflected on that scheme. And lastly, I remember that there was a question from Ibu Liana regarding the presidential regulations. What I meant earlier was the presidential regulations regarding the economic value of carbon. And currently, the preparations of the regulations related to this value of carbon includes the trading and non-trading mechanisms. And among the things regulated include trading mechanisms such as emissions permits and offsets, while for non-trading, for example, it includes the levy on carbon and RBP mechanisms. And it is also regulated regarding MRV and the formulations of a steering committee that includes cross-ministerial supervisions according to their respective roles. I think, Pak Hendra, that will be my current comment. Hopefully it helps to answer several of the concerns raised during the discussion.
Thank you very much, Bu Putu Okakusumawardani, for your response. So I think also you also touched some issue that has been raised by some participants here, including Pak Ardi Isak, in the column chat. He raising some issue inputs, and I believe most of them has been responded by Bu Putu as well. So thank you very much, Bu Putu Okakusumawardani. Okay, next I'd like to ini Pak Ben Lawson, Pak Ben Lawson. Are you going to ask a question directly to one of the presenter here, Pak Ben Lawson?
Yeah, Hendra, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Pak Ben Lawson from Sanaman Call. Okay, please, Pak.
Yeah, actually, I have just some points that any of the great panelists that you had. Thanks, by the way, for putting this on, Petramendo. Great, very, very poignant topic. The only mention I heard of CO2 equivalents was from Ibu Liana's presentation, and pointing out that CO2 is plant food, and it's going to be penalized. I'd like to bring up the CO2 equivalent factor. Bill, you had mentioned, the SOEs. It's going to be a pretty big burden considering it'll be a tax in addition to the huge subsidies. So let's look at PLN real quick. Considering that PLN is now paying coal miners 50% less than market price, let's say on a Newcastle average basis, that's adding insult to injury to the coal miners. So who's going to cover that gap as well, or will there be some kind of offset for those coal miners considering they're selling at half price? Three other areas where SOEs are huge contributors of CO2 equivalent or greenhouse gases. You've got Pertamina and PGN. They're huge emitters of methane. And methane is 28 times the CO2 equivalent when you look at the detrimental aspects to the environment as a greenhouse gas. Then you've got Pupuk Indonesia through ammonia and ammonium sulfate, huge emitters of the ammonia. That's 39 times more detrimental than the CO2 equivalent. So how is the government going to take that into consideration, or is this just a straight CO2, a carbon tax, which personally doesn't make any sense to me. I guess that would be something I'd be very interested if anyone had some input on. Thank you.
Okay, Pak Ben Lawson, Pak Bill, it's a question addressed to you, Pak Bill, please.
I'd have to agree with Ben's comments, Personati, that I really don't think the government has taken sufficiently into account the fact that state-owned enterprises are amongst the very worst emitters of greenhouse gases. And how is this going to play out in terms of the impact on the government's fiscal position? It seems to me that there's a lot of analysis needs to be done in terms of, well, if the profitability of Pertamina and PLN and Crackdow Steel and Semen Gresik and all those people is reduced significantly because they become subject to major carbon tax liabilities. Will this, and to what extent will it offset the revenue that the government derives from the private sector? I also think Ben's comment is a very fair one with regard to the already heavy burden that Indonesia's coal producers bear in having to supply coal to PLN at 50% of the market price. I mean, is it really appropriate to add to their burdens by imposing a carbon tax as well? I think this raises big issues regarding the domestic market obligation and how viable it is given the current price of coal, something that will only be exacerbated if a carbon tax also becomes payable. With regard to the more technical aspects of Ben's questions, though, with regard to methane and the like, that's really beyond my area of expertise. So those are my comments, personally.
Okay, thank you, Pak Bill Sullivan, for your response. Now, I'd like to ask Bu Liana ya, mungkin ada yang ingin ditanyakan ke Bu Putu atau pembicara yang lain. Silakan Bu Liana.
Bu Putu, maaf ya Bu, bahasa Indonesia aja Pak Hendra.
Monggo Bu Liana.
Ya, ini untuk to make me clear ya Bu, draft Perpres yang Ibu bicarakan itu yang sekarang udah sampai di Seknek ya Bu ya? Itu atau bukan? Jadi saya sedikit bingung itu, karena kita ada dua jalur, ada RUU KUP yang sekarang ada di DPR yang sedang akan konsultasi dengan asosiasi-asosiasi mulai minggu depan. Kemudian sekarang ada lagi jalur draft Perpres yang tentang carbon pricing atau nilai ekonomi karbon. Jadi yang Ibu bicarakan tadi itu Perpres yang sedang di lead oleh KLHK atau ada Perpres lain, Bu? Itu.
Ya, Bu Liana, terima kasih. Itu yang saya maksud itu adalah Perpres yang naik tadi, Bu. Karena kan sebetulnya kita bicara mengenai carbon pricing ini kan dua mekanisme ya. Satunya yang memang berdasarkan propose yang di dalam carbon tax, dan satunya lagi memang sedang dalam rumusan itu adalah yang carbon trading mechanisms. Nah, dua-duanya ini ya memang sedang berjalan beriringan gitu Bu. Tapi yang saya maksud tadi dengan Perpres itu adalah Perpres yang NEK tadi yang Ibu masuk dengan diskusi dengan KLHK dan kementerian lain terkait. Oke,
jadi posisi dari Apindo.
Mohon maaf.
Satu lagi, posisi Apindo itu kan kita
sebentar lagi Bu.
RUU KUP-nya carbon tax-nya kan nggak cocok ya Bu. Nggak, jadi itu mau tetap diterusin nggak?
Nurdin silakan lanjut dulu deh saya.
Ya. Sorry Pak Hendra. Nggak, tadi sedikit lagi KUP kan ada carbon tax. Itu mau dilanjut atau bagaimana prosesnya? Karena itunya. Ya, makasih. Sorry Pak. Supaya make clear aja.
Iya, terima kasih Bu Liana. Silakan Bu Putu.
Ya, sebetulnya kalau untuk yang carbon tax dalam Undang-Undang KUP ini diskusinya terus bergulir, terus berlanjut. Tapi kemudian implementasinya tentu memperhatikan kebutuhan untuk ekonomi kita, untuk pemulihan ekonomi dari pandemi COVID. Itu keduanya ini tetap berlanjut Ibu, tapi diskusinya untuk ruang diskusinya itu kita masih ada karena memang carbon tax itu sendiri pengaturannya masih general dalam Undang-Undang KUP-nya. Mungkin demikian ya Pak Hendra.
Oke, baik. Terima kasih Bu Putu atas responnya. Sekarang kita masih punya waktu sedikit masing-masing pembicara yang lain memberikan semacam closing atau tambahan informasi. Saya persilakan dulu Pak Ali Mardi, kemudian Pak Dendi, dan disusul oleh Pak Kris. Silakan.
Yeah, just a short note from me. I think this very interesting discussion, Pak Hendra. What need to be considered in this carbon tax, I think, is just to make sure that it's not becoming counterproductive. Like we already discussed before, it could lessen our impact to our competitiveness of our product, and also impacting our low-income people. So this is very important. Another aspect to it is for industry. Just to make sure how we can support the industry if this carbon tax is being implemented, because it will increase energy costs for sure, right, from PLN in that case. Then that's it, I think, Pak, from me. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Pak Limardi. I like your assessment on the potential impact to the PLN. So it's worrisome for us, yeah. There is a
correct, Pak. 700 million, loh, Pak.
It could means another subsidy that they will be asking to the government, to the department. Okay, thank you, Pak Ali Mardi, for your information and presentations. Pak Dendi, ada informasi atau tambahan?
Okay, yeah, probably I'll highlight the from the spending side of this, let's say, carbon tax revenue. Yeah. I think it should be properly spent to everything that relates to reduce the impact, the negative impact of the carbon. Yeah, of course the government can claim some spending, previous spending. It can be classified as the carbon effort. To reduce the impact of the carbon, but at the same time, probably the government also can claim some tax are as a carbon tax. Yeah, for example, the pajak kendaraan bermotor, BPKB, whether it is some people argue that it may be as a carbon tax. Yeah. I think it should be clear, this carbon tax and also with the other tax, to make it more, to be distinguished clearly, to make them not overlap one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Dendi Ramdhani, the economist at Bank Mandiri. I like your raising the issue on the establishment of a badan pengelola, maybe to kelola the process proceeding.
Yeah, that's another thing, Pak. It's like BPDP sawit,
Yeah, I believe our friends in the parliament would like the idea to set up the badan pengelola sawit. Okay, thank you, Pak Dendi, and Pak Kris as a representative of the mining producer. What is your closing statement or additional information, or you like to respond to what Bu Putu has any comment tadi, Pak Kris?
Thank you, Pak Hendra. So that's be cautious about that. Number one is coal mining itself using energy is only 34% of the energy. So impact is little bit, but again, it will be affect to the competitiveness with the Australian that carbon tax is 0. Is number one, and number two is, but it will be impacted to the mineral like nickel, like aluminium, like antam, like process that hungry of the energy, that using 73% of cost structure is for the energy. That will be impact to the industry of the mineral and the downstream of the mineral. And number three is about the downstream of the coal itself, because in the transition, that roadmap that put by mineral or Ministry of the Energy and Mineral, that said is transition is included to the downstream of the coal, and its mean is almost 50% the energy is come from coal, and so it's mean the downstream will be not viable anymore. So please, let's talk about that, Pak Hendra and Bu Putu, and that's my closing statement.
Thank you, Pak Chris. So it means it will be harder for coal producers to carry out energy transition as mandated by the government under the law number 3/2020. So thank you very much, Bu Putu, Bu Liana, Pak Bill Sullivan, Pak Dendi Ramdhani, Pak Ali Mardi, Pak Hari Krisnyono for the great discussions. Waktunya kita udah running out of time, tapi banyak sekali yang mungkin belum terjawab. Terima kasih banyak dan mudah-mudahan ada lanjutan diskusi-diskusi yang lebih produktif mungkin ya Bu Putu. Terima kasih, BKF sangat membuka diri untuk masukan dari berbagai asosiasi. We really appreciate it, Bu Putu. Kita akan sering bertemu nanti, Bu Liana juga ya, dengan Bu Putu dan teman-teman semua. Thank you very much for all your kind participation. I get back to Pak Adianto dan Bu Desi to close the sessions.
Okay, thank you, Pak Hendra. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with us. This is the end of webinar exploring carbon tax on mining sector. Well, I believe we all agree that this has been a very fruitful discussion. Before we close this webinar, let's take a picture to all panelists for documentation. You can
silakan
put
aja
your
duluan,
thumbs up.
Silakan ya Pak Murudin, Bu. Ini silakan aja ya. Saya join dulu.
We can put our thumbs up and take a picture together. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Thank you, Desi.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Desi.
To all participants, speakers, panelists, and moderator, Ibu Oka from Ministry of Finance, Pak Bill Sullivan, Bu Liana Bratasida, Pak Chris from Medco, Pak Dendi Ramdhani, Bank Mandiri, Pak Ali Mardi from Deloitte, and Pak Hendra Sinadia, who have made your valuable time to be here today. We appreciate it so much. And once again, on behalf of Coal and Mineral Asia Magazine and Petromindo, we would like to also express our deep appreciation and thank you to our sponsor, PT Pama Persada Nusantara. Thank you very much for your support and great contribution. Stay safe and stay healthy, everyone, and hope to see you again at our next events.
Terima kasih Bapak Ibu, sangat berguna.
Terima kasih semua. Hendra,
Pak
Adianto,
Pak Bill, thank you, Pak Dendi,
Pak Bill, Pak Ali, Pak
Diana,
Diana,
Pak Chris.